Mommy wouldn't wake up, and I didn't know why. I didn't draw any particular connection between that and the used needles scattered around her bedroom. After all, those were just her special medicine. They helped her body work right, so she would feel okay. She was always so sad and mean when she went without for too long, so I liked her medicine. But I didn't like the way she had to get it, how all these strange men came into our home, men who made me uncomfortable with the way they smelled, the way they looked at me. But I figured they must be nice deep down, because they always helped Mommy get more of her medicine. They let me and my dog Bandit play in the living room while they went to the bedroom, and a little while later, he'd leave, and Mommy would be able to buy more of her medicine and feel okay again. That was what she told me, and that's what I believed. God help me, I was only a child then. How was I supposed to know any better? But even as blissfully ignorant as I was, I could tell that something was horribly, horribly wrong. After all, I'd never seen somebody sleep with their eyes open before. They were wide and bloodshot, staring up at the ceiling as if in a state of constant horror at what she was witnessing. It made me uncomfortable, so I covered them with a blanket. Most kids, you'd figure, would have called the police. But the cops just weren't a part of my world back then. I was always told that they were the bad guys, that they would try to take me away if I ever told them a single thing about Mommy or the men or her medicine. I had no other family, nor friends, nor any other lifelines. I was on my own. My approach to the problem was unorthodox. First I tried giving her more of her medicine, of course, but I couldn't figure out the syringes, and I only cut myself badly trying. Then I tried to coax her awake with my toys. We'd spent so much time together playing with my Power Rangers and Hot Wheels, I figured it must have been her favorite thing to do. Bandit, as good a dog as ever, even tried to help, bringing his favorite raccoon Stuffy and dropping it at her side. It didn't rouse her. I tried for hours, which was impressive given my childhood attention span. But soon, concern turned to boredom. If she wanted to be lazy for a while, so be it. The first 2 or 3 days were actually pretty sweet. Mom wasn't around to stop me from stuffing my face full of all the candy and junk food I could reach, or coloring all over the walls and floors, or sitting as close to the TV as I wanted as I watched cartoons or played my shitty SpongeBob TV game. Our apartment was a dump in retrospect, crawling with ants and cockroaches, but to my eyes, it was my own personal Xanadu. It wasn't long before problems began to arise, though. Rationing wasn't exactly a concept in my young mind. The snacks and junk food barely kept the hunger at bay, so I ran through them quickly. That left me with meals I didn't know how to prepare, and cans I didn't know how to open. Hell, I wasn't even tall enough to reach half the shelves in the pantry. In desperation, I took to eating leftovers dredged up from the garbage and whole, dry bricks of ramen noodles. At one point, I managed to create a tiny hole in a can of tomato soup by smashing it on everything in the house, and took to holding it over my head so the tiny droplets would fall into my mouth. Still, no matter how starved I felt, everything I ate, I shared with Bandit. We were best pals until the end. It wasn't until almost a week had passed that the thing first appeared. I was awoken late on the 5th night to the sound of Bandit whining and pacing beside my bed. The window rattled as a thunderstorm billowed against the house, and I could barely hear my own thoughts over the roaring of the wind. It must have caused a power outage, because the hallway outside my bedroom was completely dark. No, even that was an understatement. There wasn't that gradual fade into darkness you'd expect, rather, it was like there was some point in the doorway from which no light could escape, like a solid wall of darkness blacker than I'd ever thought possible. Bandit was whimpering and growling at it, and I knew exactly why. Some primitive part of my brain was roaring with the instinct that warned our hunter-gatherer ancestors that a predator was stalking them from the shadows, in the same way that you can sense when a face is pressed up against your window even when the curtains are closed. Something was there. Just barely beyond that veil of shadows. It was too dark for me to even see a silhouette, yet I was still certain of it. But somehow I felt just as certain that if only I could close the door, I'd be safe. I don't know how I worked up the courage to start creeping towards it. It was like the doorway was a vortex, pulling me forwards. I was shaking from head to toe by the time I finally stood in front of the door, peering out into what looked like an infinite void of blackness. I couldn't see anything, hear anything, feel anything, smell anything, yet every single atom of my body was screaming at me that a monster was right there, inches in front of me, ready to swing its terrible claws out at any moment and drag me into that blackness. I craned my head to look up at the spot in the darkness where I was certain the thing's head must be, and somehow I could sense a pair of eyes staring back. I slammed the door shut as hard as I could. I always kept my bedroom door closed and locked every night afterwards. And sometimes, I'd be awoken to the sound of Bandit whining and growling at it again, and I'd lay there in bed, paralyzed, straining my ears expecting to hear footsteps at the door, or scratching, or knocks. Somehow, the silence was scarier. The sixth morning, I found my mom sitting limp on the couch in the living room, those wide, vacant eyes burning holes into the opposite wall. I actually welcomed the sight. In my mind, it was confirmation she was only sleeping, as she must have gotten up and watched TV here for a bit before returning to her slumber. It never occurred to me that something might have moved her. Still, that look in her eyes made me uncomfortable, and she was really starting to smell, so I laboriously dragged her body back to her bedroom. The apartment was quickly feeling more and more like a prison. The windows were obscured by burglars' bars and curtains I couldn't reach the cords to, so the sense of claustrophobia was becoming suffocating, and all I could think about those sunny days at the playground in the park. I could barely tell if it was day or night anymore. And anything even remotely edible while long gone, too, even the little crumbs I picked out of the garbage. I'd vent these feelings by throwing a tantrum over my mom, sobbing, screaming, begging for her to wake up, even hitting her over and over. Still, no luck. My final gambit was to just go knock on someone's door and beg them for help. I was raised to be absolutely terrified of talking to strangers, but this time, my hunger won out. The room beyond my front door was creepy even in the best of circumstances, a cramped, musty brutalist concrete stairwell dimly lit by sparse, flickering lights, cockroaches vanishing in and out of cracks in the wall. It was only standing there in the doorway, taking in the silence, that I finally realized something which, above all else, turned my blood to ice. For this entire week, I hadn't heard a single noise from my neighbors. Not once. If you've ever lived in an apartment complex, you know the constant cacophony of your neighbors becomes the background music of your life. But the man upstairs hasn't done his usual stomping, and the couple beside hasn't been arguing. It's been days of dead silence, as if I were the only human being in the building. The stairwell seemed darker than it should be, and colder. I wish I could have told you some primitive instinct drove me back to the safety of my room. But what instinct could be more ancient and primal than hunger itself? I didn't bother checking whether my neighbors were really still there or not. I could feel piercing eyes staring at me from the holes in every door as I passed by, as if eagerly waiting for me to knock. I didn't give them the pleasure. All I felt I knew was that if only I could make it to the lobby, I could leave this terrible place and find somebody who'll help. I wasn't the only one who needed it, after all. I was worried for my mom, and Bandit, too. It was my love for them that helped steel my courage as I wandered down those concrete steps. The concrete floor felt like ice beneath my bare little feet. I knew my neighbors had long vanished, yet I could sense eyes staring at me from every peephole as I passed. Even if everyone else was gone, I felt certain that the kindly old lady from the lobby would still be there, that once I reached her, she would make it all better and everything would be okay. I don't know why I felt so certain. Perhaps it was the dash of hope my young mind needed to brave that darkness. Imagine my disappointment when I reached floor 0 and there was no lobby. The stairwell just continued. And when I delved further, the floor signs read -1, then -2-3, not that I'd any idea what those meant. I was crying now, but the tears were freezing upon my cheeks. It was so damn cold, and getting colder. It felt like something could come at me from any angle. I imagined hands suddenly reaching out from over the stair railings or down from the upper well, or even apartment doors bursting off their hinges as some monster rushed me from within. But when it did come, it came from below, while I was descending one of the stairwells. And long before it crept into sight, I could hear its heaving, crooked crawls scratching upon that concrete floor. My heart seized in my chest as she crawled into view at the bottom of the steps. She was a girl not too far from my age, with tawny skin and dark cornrows, and a pink Dora the Explorer t-shirt rendered almost unrecognizable by filth. I wish I could tell you she had black eyes and an impossibly wide smile. At least then I could comfort myself with the knowledge she was never truly human. But no. She just looked sick. Her eyes were rolled back in her skull such that only half her pupils were visible, and her mouth hung slackly open, like a blackened pit from which vomit oozed down her chin. Her head twitched and jerked as if having convulsions, and she let out wheezing little croaks like an asthmatic frog. To this day, I struggle to make sense of how she walked. She laid nearly crawling along on her belly, pulled forward by her arms which appeared to have two elbows. In retrospect, they were digitigrade, shaped entirely like a dog's forelegs. Her legs were worse still, impossibly bent forward over her shoulders, feet resting on the ground before her. At first I wondered if she'd been mutilated by some terrible injury, until I realized her legs simply had 4 or 5 knees, all bent in the wrong direction, allowing her to kick her feet against the ground to help her jagged gallop. She was a terrifying sight, but she wasn't the main thing I was afraid of. I could sense she wasn't the monster. She was just another victim. After all, the real monster was standing right behind me. It was the exact same feeling I had with the darkness at my bedroom door, but now I could hear, feel, its warm breath against the back of my neck, billowing out from only inches away. They were belabored breaths, as if multiple pairs of lungs were inflating with every inhale, yet still found a way to seem short, shallow and rapid. It was the frantic breathing of someone barely able to contain their perverse excitement and anticipation, like a perv at a peep show or a druggie about to get his next big fix. I didn't wait to find out what it was so excited for. Instead, I sent myself leaping headlong over the stair railings. It was quite the feat of acrobatics and quick thinking, considering the railing was as tall as I was, and I ordinarily could barely count to 10. But somewhere in the back of my mind, I swear I could hear my mother's voice, telling me exactly what I needed to do to make it away from this nightmare. I landed on the stairway below, and took off sprinting down the steps, somehow certain that my salvation waited somewhere deeper. I could hear the clap-clap behind me as the little girl ran on her hands in a jerking, twisted pursuit, all while the thing from the darkness followed just behind like a master guiding a dog by its leash. Every so often she'd brace those malfigured legs against the concrete and spring herself down a stairwell in leapfrog fashion, slamming into the walls behind me, missing by inches. My little lungs burned, my legs pushing me farther and faster than it should have been physically possible for any kid my age to accomplish. The numbers on the wall descended far deeper than was possible, -14, -15, -16, and soon they grew nonsensical, -108, -489, -7,370, before being replaced with inscrutable symbols or just being left blank altogether. Apartment doors began slamming open as I passed by, all revealing blank voids of darkness in which I swore I could faintly see silhouettes as I passed by. I ran past them without a thought. There had to be an end, a bottom to this fathomless chasm. There had to be. I don't know how long I ran. You could tell me it lasted 10 minutes or 10 years, and I wouldn't be surprised either way. I paused only when I reached a floor somewhere deep in that infinite abyss, and found the first deviation from endless stairwells, an exit sign. I couldn't read it, but I recognized that neon red. I diverted from the stairs, tore down that concrete hallway without doors or features or lights, disappeared deep into that fathomless dark, until, at the end, there stood my mother. No, not stood. Her feet didn't touch the ground, and her body was pallid and limp, just dangling there, sickly yellow eyes bulging widely towards me. Her head bent at an angle, and overall it looked like someone had stuck a blade through her neck and pinned her body to the wall. It was grotesque, but my young mind didn't notice, or care. I only knew one thing for sure. Mommy meant safety. I ran to her, wrapped my little arms around her dangling landings, buried my face in her dress and let the soft fabric dry my tears, and in a moment, it was all gone. The darkness, the frigid chill, the thing behind me. All the terrors of the stairwell. When I finally worked up the courage to open my eyes, I was home. Safe in my mother's bedroom, clinging to her body right where I had left her. She wasn't as warm as she used to be, and she smelled ungodly too, but she was still my mom, and her presence made me feel so safe, like I was being loved and cared for. Every reserve of energy in my little body had been burned, and then further reserves I didn't even know existed. I crashed. Hard. I couldn't even stand, or so much as move a muscle. All I could do was close my eyes and let sleep take me somewhere far away, all while hugging my mother's body like a newborn hugs a teddy bear in its crib to protect it from the terror of a stormy night. That night, I dreamed of the branches of trees under the canopy of a starlit woods, and the warmth and sound of a grizzly bear eating something wet and stringy right next to my ears. I'm afraid I must end here for now. My apologies, even writing this much took a lot out of me. I figured I'd be ready to talk about it after all these years, but even now, writing from the warmth and safety of my office, I'm still left shaking at just the memory of that place. I promise I'll be back to conclude my retelling once I feel well enough. The next morning, Mommy didn't have a face. She didn't have a lot of things anymore, really. Something had taken her face, her eye, her fingers. I'd never seen blood and viscera before, so the sight confused me almost as much as it scared me. I'd woken up covered in those red chunks, and the smell made me feel sick. Was this really what people looked like, under their skin? A trail of that scarlet red led down the hall, splattered over walls and furniture. My mind swam with questions. How had I slept through it all? Who did this? The little girl or the thing that followed were my immediate suspects, but the true culprit was so much worse, Bandit. We were supposed to be best pals no matter what, yet there I spotted him, maw turned red with dried blood, ears flattened against his head, looking guilty. It was all too much. I'd been betrayed by my best friend, and my mom, once my only source of comfort, wasn't even recognizable anymore. Worse still, the reality of the situation was finally starting to dawn on my developing mind. Things weren't going to go back to the way they used to be. I wasn't yet ready to comprehend the idea of eternity, but, somewhere in the back of my mind, there was a growing flicker of understanding that my mom wasn't going to wake up from all this. The thought racked me with a profound terror I wasn't yet ready to handle, and I threw myself at her side, shaking her limp body. Mommy, please. You have to wake up. You're really hurt, Mommy. You have to go to the doctor. You have to. I choked out the words through bitter tears, my voice raising until I was screaming myself hoarse, as if volume alone would make her wounds disappear and her eyes open and we could go back to being a family again. Only the silence answered. I curled up and cried somewhere far away from the mess of red meat that had once been my mother. But eventually, I felt a cold snout bump against my back. It was Bandit, sniffing me close as if to check on me. I tensed, disgusted by his audacity, roughly shoving him away from me with a hand. No. Go away. Bad dog. You hurt Mommy. It wasn't long before he nudged me again, and in a fit of rage I swung around and punched him in the snout hard enough to make him yelp. I said go away. But I immediately felt bad, watching him slink guiltily away. And when he poked his head back in a good 15 minutes later, I sighed and beckoned to him with a hand. I'm sorry, Bandit. He trotted forward and I wrapped him in the biggest hug I could muster, and I couldn't help but giggle softly as he licked over my cheek as if to wipe away my tears. You're a good dog. You were just hungry. I'm hungry, too. I love you. But of course, even now, her body wouldn't stay still. I was used to being awoken these nights, usually due to my piercing hunger or night terrors or their presence at the door. This time, however, it was from a clattering downstairs. It seemed familiar, like the sound of someone loading dishes into the washer. Had Mommy finally woken up? A day ago, I would have jumped for joy at the idea. Now it filled me with terror, even if I couldn't say why. Something about imagining that faceless thing hobbling down the hallways. I crept downstairs at a snail's pace, bracing myself, yet still I yelped in surprise at the sight of her. Her body'd been propped up limply at a chair at the dining table, facing my way as if expecting me. A spaghetti mess of ratty, molding hair, thin and stiff and black like a spider's legs, was draped over that concave crevasse that had once been a face, all splotches of red with glimmers of white where her teeth remained embedded in the meat. Said meat was turning an ashy black, pocked by holes where insects had begun to lair like creatures resting in caves along a cliff face, the largest being the socket of her consumed left eye which a maggot family now called home. Her right eye had been tugged halfway out of its socket, looking wide and glassy and yellow, bent sideways as if staring at the wall. I was so struck by it, it took a second to notice that the sound was still coming, even though she was motionless. Something else was in the kitchen, seemingly knocking about pots and pans, sorting through glasses and silverware, making as much noise as possible like a lure. The dining room was dark, but the kitchen was truly pitch black, lit only by the faintest glimmers that shone upon silverware like dots of moonlight upon a black lake. Mommy sat at the very border of that blackness with her back to it, like the Cerberus at the entrance to Hades. And then, all at once, the noises ceased, as if the thing had caught me staring, and had stopped to stare back. And once again, the silence proved worse than the sound. I took a seat at the table, across from the meat that used to be my mother. I still don't know why. It just felt like what I was supposed to do. There we sat in a twisted, mocking facsimile of the family dinners we so used to enjoy, as I tried to pay attention to anything but the look and smell of her, as everything around us faded to silence and dark. Just as I thought the silence would last forever, Mommy sprung to life. No, not her. Something behind her, in the darkness, using her like a puppet. Even as a child, I knew instantly those movements were not hers. They were like a marionette's, stiff and jerky and artificial. But her voice was unmistakable. "Good morning, my darling." Oh, that was quite the refreshing rest. Silence. "What's the matter, my love? Aren't you glad to see your mama?" I heard Bandit growling, and turned to see him stood beside me, head low, ears up, eyes wide like a deer's, staring into the darkness. He was thinking the same thing I was. Why you're not my mommy. That black abyss in its scarlet knot face spread wide in a way that, I guess, was supposed to be analogous to a smile. Why, don't be ridiculous, child. A hand jerked upwards to wave dismissively. I was just having a little nap. You know us moms. We work so hard. We need lots of rest. But I'm awake now. Okay, honey. Everything is okay. I stood from my chair, tears blurring my vision. No. It's not okay. I yelled, all that fear and frustration bubbling up. You're not my mommy. Where's my mommy? I hate this. I hate you. I want to go home. My real home, with my real mommy. And as I screamed and cried, the thing's knot face slowly soured, as though the sound of my tantrum was like nails on a chalkboard. Now. Don't cry. You know, mommy doesn't like it when you cry. It winced and shuddered. Its voice lowered. You've already made this far more difficult than it had to be, you little whore. As she growled those last words, her voice lowered into something else. It didn't sound much like a voice, but rather an itching coming from inside my own head, like a fingernail scratching against my eardrum directly. I screamed, and Bandit took that as his cue. His barking tore through the silence as he stormed fearlessly into the darkness, and somehow managed to sink his teeth into something solid in all that black. There came a sound roughly comparable to the squealing of a pig being put through an industrial lathe hooves first, and the creature threw my mother's corpse away in such a fashion that it seemed to go pouncing over the table onto me. I was sobbing as I was knocked backwards in my chair, the body flopping limply atop me, maggots and blackened blood and bits of turgid meat splattering upon my cheeks. I wriggled out from under her with all the strength I could give, and went blindly fleeing, crying and wailing to the tune of Bandit snarling and tearing at something unfathomable far behind me. The facade of my apartment was flickering all around me, as if the illusion was crumbling as my loyal pooch mauled its creator. Once again I was merely sprinting through an endless course of rooms I recognized, but which were somehow off, the geometry warped and twisted in impossible ways, like I was not in the rooms themselves but in half-faded memories of these rooms made manifest. TV flickering between violent and profane images over a soundtrack like someone smashing keys on a piano. Doors slammed shut before me, and each clung stubbornly closed, but then I'd think of my mother's loving face, and they would yield. And then things emerged from those implacable darknesses. The shadow things from the apartment doorways. The things that were children, or had once been children, long ago in days when they'd been loved by anybody but the creature in the dark. Things twisted into lattices of rusted metal, bones broken and bent and allowed to heal in wrong directions to fit those twisted industrial shapes, hobbling forth on bony legs as if struggling to maintain their own weight. There was no way they could catch me at that speed, but it seemed they hoped their visages alone would terrify me into paralysis. And they almost did, until a friend rejoined my side. I felt the fur brush my leg, and I screamed, ready to kick and scratch at it. But I turned and saw it was Bandit, and if I didn't know any better, I'd say there was a smug, triumphant little grin on my dog's face. The fur around his muzzle was wet with the thing's blood, no, not blood, but something black, thick and curdled. He showed no fear, only a determination to shepherd me through the valley of darkness. But behind me, the darkness followed. I could hear that entity screaming from a mouth that was not a mouth, roaring in a sort of infrasound that could not be heard by the ears but which rattled the mind and twisted the stomach into knots. Doors slammed and lights shattered in its wake as if it were afraid to ever step into the light. The floor rumbled and shook as it grew nearer, until I could feel its breath against the back of my neck. And then I pushed through one more door, and floated away into an endless expanse of white. I closed my eyes, if only because the very brightness itself pained me. But that horrible, raspy breathing was replaced with another, one low and gentle, a kind I recognized from snuggling up to my mother on many a sleepless night. One last time, I got to feel her hold me close and nuzzle her chin against mine. She whispered a vow of love in some language I didn't understand, and I'll never forget her meaning even if I can't express it with words alone. And somewhere far off behind me, something was rumbling. And I was home. Sitting on the floor in front of the TV, where the Dora the Explorer theme song was blaring. Toys and action figures scattered across the floor before me, and two social workers standing over me, flashing a light in my eyes, trying to figure out why I wasn't responsive. Nobody ever believed a word of my story. The only hard proof I have to offer is that, while her bed was found caked in dried blood, my mother's body was never found. Not even a trace of it. After that, I found a new home living with my distant aunt and uncle twice removed, a plain couple who just happened to take pity on the poor child with the tweaker mother. They would always talk about how inseparable me and Bandit seemed to be. How my loyal pooch would always stand by my side, as if always guarding against something. He was sick for a few months after all that happened. My uncle said he must have taken a bite out of something he shouldn't have. But he pulled through, and I still have my scrappy old mutt today, pampered with all the treats and belly rubs he could ask for. But I can see in his eyes that what we saw in those days never left him. And it hasn't left me either. Our society is sick. So many children like me fall through the cracks every day, and nobody notices. Nobody cares. It's a cruel enough fate to go through your short life without ever feeling the warmth or the light of care or love. Crueler still to fall into the hands of the thing that waits for them out in the dark. A few weeks ago, a girl vanished from a poor apartment near me. Not a single hint left that she'd ever existed. No family, no manhunt, just a footnote in the papers. And when once I was roused late in the night by Bandit's growls, and dared open my eyes, I swear I could see her beady little eyes staring at me from the absolute darkness behind the crack in the door.